You've probably heard the maxim that writing is rewriting. That's 100% true, but you probably knew that. And your question is actually more along the lines of, but how do you rewrite? Or maybe a better one is, how do you approach rewriting and revising your screenplay? And I'm going to explain it using this. So what's a funnel have to do with revision? Oh, we're getting into that. If you're going to take the time to tell a story, then tell a story that matters. So you have a completed draft and you're ready to revise, but where do you start? What should you focus on first? And on the surface, those answers to those questions are actually fairly simple as long as you understand the context of how screenplays are written.
Yes! Oh, God.
I'll have what she's having.
But most writers just jump into writing without giving any regard to the entirety of the process, and the problems begin right off the bat. So I want to start in a vacuum and show you what the process should be, at least for beginning screenwriters. If the conditions are perfect, these funnels are going to get you from a completed first draft to a refined and polished final draft. And as you advance in the craft and in your experience, you won't need to write as many drafts as I'm about to explain, and that will make sense in a few moments. So for the process, as I've hinted at, I'm going to use the metaphor of funnels, and there are 3 of them that we're going to unpack. But the first funnel is story. And in our ideal vacuum, the first few drafts are focused on crafting a clear story from beginning to the end of your script. So at the top of the funnel, we have our unrefined story, our first draft. So if you haven't gotten to the end, you're not at the top of the funnel yet. You're just barely entering it once you've got that first draft. We're just right here at the top. At the bottom is a refined story. Now notice I didn't say refined screenplay. We've got some other funnels to do. We're focusing on the story first. And in our story funnel, there's about 5 different levels that you have to go through to get to the bottom of this funnel. So about 5 different drafts, give or take. Now, you don't have to do them in this order, but you do want to make sure that these levels are dealt with in your story funnel when you are revising the story part. So while you're in this funnel, you want to be focusing on these 5 things. 1 is the first draft. So you can't get into the funnel until you have a first draft. You just got to get to the end of the story. Number 2, the plot. Number 3, characters and character arcs. Number 4, twists and reversals. And number 5, a coherent beginning, a cohesive middle, and a compelling and satisfying ending. So in our perfect world, if a beginning screenwriter writes a draft, they're going to need about 4 more drafts just to make sure the story is working properly, focusing on each one of these levels in each subsequent draft. And you don't get to move to the next funnel until this funnel of story is working. But once the story is working properly, now you can move into the next funnel, which is all about the storytelling. Now, storytelling is about the audience's experience of participating in the story. And like the story funnel, there are some specific things you should be focusing on. And again, you don't have to address them in this order, but I found this is a good place to start. Now, in the storytelling funnel, you'll have to deal with these 4 levels or 4 different drafts if you approach each of these things independent of each other. So each thing might be a separate draft. So 4 levels, 4 drafts. And those 4 levels are the pacing of the story, ensuring a consistent tone for your story, infusing a consistent voice throughout the story, and properly managing the emotional experience of the audience. Now, there are other pieces of storytelling you can include, but these will get you most, if not all the way there, as long as you pay specific attention to them. And once your storytelling funnel is working like you want, then you have one more funnel, because you've gone through the story funnel, so your story's working. You've gone through the storytelling funnel, so you know the audience, and more importantly, the reader, is going to have a satisfying emotional experience along the way. But now you get to funnel number 3, which is the finesse funnel. And in the finesse funnel, it typically takes 1 to 3 drafts for most writers, and you're doing passes where you're fixing the little things like grammar, lines of dialogue, word choice, or formatting, which includes formatting individual pages to make sure the page breaks or cliffhangers are in appropriate places to keep the reader engaged and to keep them reading from beginning to end. And depending on how you define a draft, you'll have a couple of drafts or levels in this funnel. And in our vacuum, that's what should be happening. But that's not what usually happens, and I'm getting into that in a second. But in our perfect world, when you write a screenplay, your process of drafting and revisions move you from the macro to the micro. Story first, the big swings. You're going to be taking out whole sections, writing new ones, removing characters, adding characters, massively changing characters, subplots, all to get the story working on every cylinder. And we don't care about anything else at this point, just the story. So here's a little tip for you when you're writing your first few drafts. Stop worrying about the little stuff, whether the dialogue is too on the nose or whether your locations are interesting enough. Who cares? Get the story working. That's your goal. Everything else comes after you get the story working, because only then will you know what story and character beats you need to keep and which ones you need to dump.
There's only half a dozen kegs of powder! Then load the rum!
And after the story is working, then you can move into the storytelling.
Aye, the rum too!
Now here we might be moving scenes, we might be rewriting scenes or altering the dialogue, but we aren't removing story and character beats. We're manipulating how the audience experiences those beats.
You've been a lovely, lovely witness.
And once the emotions are there, we've got the storytelling funnel done, now we can finesse. Then we can make it pretty. Now we can fix any inconsistencies in our formatting. Now we can probably read all the dialogue out loud to see if the words are hard to say together. And we may make some adjustments, but we aren't changing the story, we aren't changing character, and we aren't changing emotion. We might be enhancing each of those with word choice or grammar or format or whatever, but we are now focused on the micro, the little stuff. We aren't moving or altering scenes, we're just fine-tuning everything. And when you approach the process of revision, this is how you should be approaching it, macro to micro. And that means that all the formatting stuff you think is super important, you shouldn't be worrying about that in your first, second, or probably even fifth draft. That comes later. Focus on the story first, then the storytelling, then worry about finessing it. But we have a few problems.
Harry, the clock on that 9-foot nuclear weapon is ticking.
Number one, many writers spend time trying to figure out their story while they are in the midst of writing it. And if you've watched other videos on this channel, you know how I feel about this strategy. And the reason I don't like it will make a bunch of sense here in a moment, but if you're trying to figure out your story in the writing, you are forcing yourself into at least one, if not two, additional complete revisions just for the plot element alone. And in my opinion, that's just a colossal waste of time. The second problem is most writers don't even know what the fundamental parts of story are, much less how to recognize if they have all the parts or not in their script. You know, many wannabe writers work on feeling rather than knowing. So they feel they have a story, but they don't know. So when you ask a new writer if they have a complete story, they think, well, I started and I got to the end, so yeah, I have a story. But if you don't have the required parts of a story, you don't have a story. I'm sorry, you don't. And trying to revise the storytelling elements at this point is a waste of time, because you're just going to have to go back and fix the story. The story has to come first. And if you don't know what a story is, how a story works, or what elements make up successful stories, and whether or not you have them in yours, you're going to be writing even more revision drafts.
Fellas, it was sounding great, but I could have used a little more cowbell.
The third problem is a lot of writers think their initial draft is much further along in the funnels than it actually is. In fact, many new writers think their completed first draft is pretty decent, and they go about revising how they think they should revise, maybe changing a character or two or plot twist here or there, and then they just jump into the finesse funnel. And that's a huge issue. You know, practically, here's what this looks like. You're revising your script, which you think is done, but if I were to stop and ask you, tell me what the main tension of your story is, and you can't tell me, but you're busy fixing grammar because you think you're in the finesse funnel, you're actually wasting your time. You know, the main tension has to do with story. And if you don't know what a story is, you don't know what a main tension is, you don't know what the pieces of story are, you can't effectively move to the next funnel. You just can't.
I got a fever. And the only prescription is more cowbell.
Now, if you want a crash course on story, I have the complete guide to story structure, which is linked below. I also have some videos on this channel on 3-act structure. I have videos on sequences and how you structure your story for the medium of film. So if you don't know what a story is, there are resources available, but you've got to learn story. But you also have to learn the tools of storytelling. I mean, what's dramatic irony? How do you use mystery? What's showing and not telling? What about hope and fear? Or advertising, or elements of the future, or plant and payoff. I mean, there's a host of tools you can use to make the audience feel what you want them to feel when you want them to feel it. Because storytelling is, at its core, about the emotion of the audience. So you have to know those tools that you have at your disposal, and you have to know how to manipulate the audience's emotions.
The news is completely manipulated. Everything you hear every single day is designed by corporate media to do one thing and one thing only, to keep you living in fear.
So if you don't know story, and if you don't know storytelling, but you think you're revising your script because you're just tweaking word choice and dialogue or fixing grammar, you're just doing a soft polish, you're not revising. You're just moving the sand around in the sandbox. You're not building a sandcastle. And at its core, revision is a lot of hard work. And a lot of writers just don't want to do the hard work. I'm sorry, that's just the truth. But this is the process of revision. And if you're paying attention, this is also the process for drafting a screenplay. And again, within each funnel, you can shift the things around. So you can order and address the components in any way you want. It doesn't matter. As long as you stay within that funnel until you move to the next funnel. Make sure one funnel is working before you move to the next. But there are some landmarks you need to be hitting along the way. And as I talk about these, I'm going to also drop a couple of hints and tips along the way that should at least give you a plan for approaching each of these pieces. Landmark number 1, know what a story is and be able to identify all the parts in your story. And contrary to popular belief, you should figure out your story in the outline or planning stage. Now, your outline can be as detailed as you want. I mean, you can write a treatment, which is basically a short story of your entire movie, and treatments can be anywhere from 1 page to 20 or 30 or more. You can create index cards if you want. You can craft a beat sheet. You can use a story model like Save the Cat or Dan Harmon's Story Circle. Just be aware that those models may not be revealing all the components you need to ensure you have a complete story. Those models mix story and storytelling elements. Your first landmark is about having a story, not in the telling of it. And there are other ways to outline a story other than what I've just mentioned here. But why are you going to spend time writing a screenplay if you don't even know if you have a story? And this is what more experienced writers know. The more you write, the more you understand story, the more you begin to hone and figure out the best way to plan a story. And this is why experienced writers have fewer drafts in funnel 1. They plan out their story before they even start writing. Many even plan out their characters and their character arcs and subplots and all the twists and turns before they write a single word. And yes, some writers don't write anything down in the planning, but they've been doing stories for so long, they inherently know when things should happen and what the required story pieces are. So they just include them naturally, just like you're naturally breathing right now without even thinking about it. And sure, plans change when you start writing the story, but if you've planned it out properly, you know what you need and what you don't when your story changes and the characters are actually speaking to you in the writing. So if you want to write fewer drafts, spend time planning your story to make sure you have a solid story before you start writing. Landmark number 2, get the story functional. Too many writers want to skip to the storytelling funnel too soon, but you have to make sure your story is functional from beginning to end, that each character makes sense. And no, this isn't the first landmark, okay? The first landmark is to plan your story before you write. This puts you at the top of the story funnel. This landmark, number 2, get your story functional after you've written it. This is what happens at the bottom of the story funnel. So before you can move on to the storytelling funnel, you got to make sure your story is working. And this is where you might share your script with a few people. So here's a tip. Don't just ask for random feedback. Hey, how did you feel about the story? Don't do that. Ask them specific questions. Ask them to tell you what your story is about after they read the script. Ask them whose story is it. What were they pursuing? Did they get it or not? You know, the pieces of what make a story a story. And if they can tell you those things, you are well on your way to having a functional story. And you can also do this with subplots and other supporting characters. And a second tip, for each character and each scene, you've got to ask the question, does the story require them? I mean, if the character isn't integral to the story, dump them. Or combine them with another character. If a scene doesn't move the story forward, so there's no story beat, and it doesn't move a character forward, so no character beat, you gotta dump it.
All these rubber hoses gotta go, Max. Count them up.
Somebody tell me what this is. Plastic ice cream scoop? What'd that cost, about $400?
And in all of this, what you're doing is making sure you have a functional story. And once you do, now you move to landmark number 3. Effectively telling the story so it emotionally moves an audience. This is your goal in telling a story. I mean, if the audience isn't emotionally moved, they don't care about the story. Your story will have zero impact on them. You must make sure you are helping the audience track with the emotion throughout the story. So here's a tip for you. Once you think you've got through the storytelling funnel, okay, so you've told the story, have a few new people read your script and ask them to note where they were excited about something happening, where they were happy something was happening, where they were worried about something happening, or where they were sad about something happening. Just those 4 things. Have them make notes within the script. I was feeling this here, feeling this here. You should do the same on your own script where you think the audience should be feeling those things. You give them a clean version, and then when they give it back, you see if your script matches theirs. If they're excited when you think they should be excited, if they're sad when you think they should be sad, okay, now you're on the right track. But if none of your marks match theirs, well, you've still got some work to do.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
The last landmark, making it pretty on the page. You've worked hard on the script, so make it pretty. Make sure everything is consistent. Run some reports on your screenwriting software to see if you've misspelled a character name or if your location naming convention is inconsistent. Make sure you have some good white space on the first several pages for sure, so the reader is quickly turning pages and getting into the meat of your story. Make sure the last pages read quickly. Quadruple check to make sure you don't have any grammatical errors, especially in the first 10 pages. Now here's a tip, read your script out loud during the finesse funnel, because reading it out loud forces you to slow down and notice more words and punctuation on the page. You'll always catch a bunch of things in your polish passes by doing this one little thing. Now, as far as the writing itself goes, I can't tell you how to do that part. You have to put your butt in the chair and do it. But if you approach not only your revision process, but your drafting process in this way, using funnels, it will help you more efficiently move through the revision and the drafting process. Plus, it'll help you manage your expectations. It kind of takes the pressure off. So when you write that first, second, or third draft, it doesn't have to be perfect. You're just trying to get the story down. Who cares if the dialogue is bad? You'll fix that in a later pass anyway. Focus on the story, then focus on the storytelling, then focus on the finesse. And if you want more information about story, there are links below that can help you with that. If you want some help with knowing story and storytelling and becoming familiar with those tools, you should check out the Screenwriting Fast Track. That's what that's all about. But if you want my help with the process, including feedback all along the way, going all the way through the funnels, book a free call to apply for the Screenplay Navigator. I walk with you for this entire process for the screenplays that you're working on. And if you want to learn more about one planning strategy of using beat sheets, I walk through how to do them and I show you an example of a beat sheet from one of my scripts in this video. Links below. Don't forget about all the fun buttons that help others find this channel. And when you decide to tell a story and ultimately revise it, tell a story that matters. See you later.